Hi theory students. Today is part 2 of our chapter on embellishments and four voices. We'll be talking about the concept of accented versus unaccented notes, chromatic passing and chromatic neighbor tones, and double neighbor tones and double passing tones. Accented versus unaccented refers to the normal metric accent. And we always describe this relative to the note that an embellishment is being resolved to. Let me show you some examples. Here, in 4/4, the downbeat, of course, gets the strongest accent. Beat 2 is weaker. Beat 3 is not as strong as the downbeat, but stronger than beat 2 or beat 4. So something like this. The C and the A are accented relative to the B flat and the F. In addition, even something on what's considered a weaker beat, like this down below, the A is accented compared to the B flat that's off the beat. So the notes on the beat are more accented than the ones off the beat. In 3/4, of course, the downbeat is still more accented, but it depends sometimes as to whether the downbeat, the second beat or the third beat is more accented relative to the other. So for instance, something like that may put a little more emphasis on beat 3, whereas changing the articulation makes beat 2 sound a little more accented than the third beat. So that's variable, and a composer has ways of arranging it either way. So to summarize, downbeat is the most accented beat in a meter. In 4/4, beat 3 more than beats 2 and 4. Anything on the beat is more accented than anything off the beat. And in 3/4, you have to look at the context to see whether beat 2 or beat 3 is more accented than the other, but the downbeat is still the strongest. The next topic has to deal with chromatic passing tones and chromatic neighbor tones. A chromatic passing tone fills the gap of a whole step with the chromatic note in between. Chromatic neighbors shorten what would ordinarily be a whole step to a half step. It's usually used as a lower neighbor, and it works almost like a portable leading tone to one of the other notes in the scale besides the tonic. With one exception, the spelling follows the direction of the resolution. That is, notes that are raised are the ones that are resolving upward. Notes that are lowered are the ones that are resolving downward. Let's look at some examples. In the first example on the left, listen to the chromatic passing tone in the soprano line. In getting from the 1 chord to the 5/6, notice there's a whole step from C up to D, and the C sharp fills that gap. We use C sharp, not D flat, because that note is going up. Let me show you an example that works the other way. Let's take that out and put that C back in, only now in the alto, we're going to bridge that whole step from E down to D. So going from E down to D, which is a whole step, we're going to put an E flat in there. And because we're going down, we use E flat, not D sharp. Now I promised you I'd show you an exception, so let's rewrite this. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to take this E up to G, and now we want to go not to a 5-6 but to a 5-6-5. So in order to do that, we're going to the F, only in order to get there, the gap between G and F is a whole step, and I'm going to fill it in with the note in between. I need a natural sign there, and in this particular case, instead of a G flat, usually we use an F sharp. Okay, why an F sharp? There's something about the dominant note and its half step below F sharp in this key that seems to be more typical for composers, and they would rather write this particular progression, scale degree 5, raised 4, regular 4, but that's an exception. Now, on to chromatic neighbor tones. In the example up above here in 6/8, I'm going to use lower neighbors, and the first one, of course, is not chromatic. That B occurs in a C major scale normally, but now when I go to the neighbor a step above, I'm going D, its lower neighbor, and back to D. Instead of using a C natural, which is a whole step below D, I'll raise that to C sharp. I continued up the scale that way. So it's almost as though I'm creating a temporary or portable leading tone to D, C sharp, C, D, C sharp, and D. That has a very nice effect, especially on lower neighbor tones. We don't use the chromatic upper neighbor quite so much, and I'll show you why. Here's an example in which I'm going from scale degree 6 down to scale degree 5. So normally, but now the upper neighbor to 6 and the chromatic lower neighbor, we would expect in a C major scale. One of the reasons that we don't use the chromatic upper neighbor quite so much is that the ear isn't quite sure whether I'm hearing this passage in C minor or in C major. But nevertheless, if we had a chromatic neighbor, here the upper neighbor would be B flat. Over here, the chromatic lower neighbor to G would be F sharp. And finally, double neighbor tones or double passing tones. Let's talk about double neighbors first. It uses both the upper and lower neighbors to resolve to the chord tone. The figure tends to start with whichever one, upper or lower, matches the direction of the line after the resolution. It can be used with a skip between neighbors, or the skip can be filled in, and generally one of the neighbors will be a half step. Alter the lower neighbor if necessary to achieve this. I'll show you some examples. So in this case, You can hear upper neighbor, lower neighbor, and going back to the C, which is the chord tone. I'm skipping directly from the upper neighbor to the lower neighbor. In the next example, the upper neighbor A, the lower neighbor F sharp, but I'm going back to the G in between these two to make that a little bit smoother. I would usually use F sharp, not F natural, because the neighbor above G is a whole step away, the neighbor below G, F natural, is a whole step away, so we'd like at least one of those to be a half step. Here's what it sounds like if I played it with F natural. Sounds a little better than, although both are acceptable. Now, when I talked about the direction of the line, imagine if the alto line went up to A afterwards. In that case, if the G were going up, then starting the double neighbor with the higher one sounds better than there. You hear what I mean? You'll see examples when we start studying more music like this. And finally, the double passing tone. It fills the gap of a fourth between the root down to the fifth of a chord or the fifth of a chord up to the root by using two notes that are connected by step. One of them may be accented relative to the other, but the pair of double passing tones is considered an unaccented embellishment. In this example in A minor, in that first measure, A is a chord tone, E is a chord tone, but there's a gap of a fourth between them. So we can't pick one single note that's related by step to both of these. So what we do instead is use both of the notes in between, and both the G and the F are passing tones, or together a double passing tone. Going on, note in the 5-4-3, I did the same thing relative to the 5 chord. I took the root of the 5 chord, I used the two passing tones to get down to the fifth of the 5 chord. That's how the double passing tone works. It fills in the gap of a fourth instead of the usual passing tone gap of a third. That's our lesson for today.